Hello and welcome to In Transit. We have a special program today in which alumni from the Harvard Business School will be chatting on the emerging markets in India and China. Tarun Khanna, the George A. Paulo Leman Professor of the Harvard Business School, will be in conversation with Amrita Chaudhary, Associate Director, Harvard Business School, India Research Center, and a debutante novelist.
Tarun, you've got a journey thus far.
Amrita, I guess I'm a mixed product of India and the United States. In India, mostly Delhi, Bombay and Bangalore, probably in that order. And most of my adult life I've lived in the United States, though I have a very strong affinity with my country, India, and continue to work here very actively for the last decade plus. And generally have an interest in private sector-led development is the way I choose to describe it. In other words, individuals like you and me and others getting actively involved in the process of doing good and earning a living in that process. And that's the broad canvas on which I've tried to paint over the last 15-20 years in India and in other countries.
And so from your research, you've chosen the book on China and India. Tell us a little bit more about the book.
So the genesis of the book goes back to a conversation in the early part of this decade when a mainland Chinese colleague at Harvard Business School and I were having a conversation about the pros and cons of the Chinese model of development, the Indian model of development, and we were very conscious that both countries had come a long way at that time already, even though China was much more in the limelight at that time. And but they had done so in fundamentally different ways, and that the strengths of China indeed were the weaknesses of India, and vice versa. So that was just the intriguing starting point, that to social scientists like ourselves, this is as close to a natural experiment as you get. That is, two large populous countries, ancient civilizations, both having endured centuries of foreign occupation, suddenly choose to enter the world economy on their own terms at roughly the same time, 1949 for the People's Republic and 1947 for India, and do so on their own terms and do so in fundamentally different ways. And through the fact that they followed completely different paths, you can learn a lot about the pros and cons of different ways of developing. So that's almost a chance conversation that triggered that, and since then I tend to be a person who gets very absorbed and very type A, I think, is the impolite term that's used to describe it. And I just have become very enmeshed in a variety of research activities, company boards, investments, and so on in Southeast Asia, India, and China. And I found it to be an incredible learning journey along the way.
So in that context, in the book, you've highlighted the complementary ways in which India and China are different. And there is an extract which I found really interesting. You say, in China, the government demanded performance and held to aggressive timelines. So can you talk a little bit more about that and contrast it with our country here?
I think one of the really interesting things for us in India is to look at the way that the state apparatus has functioned in China and continues to function. Now, people always comment on people who are first-time visitors to China, or frequent visitors to China for that matter, always comment and are amazed, as am I, by the fantastic physical infrastructure, and particularly people from India or parts of Africa, or places where the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure is compromised, justifiably admire the enormous achievements of the Chinese people and the Chinese state. I think it's perhaps equally interesting, if not more interesting, to understand how that comes about. And in the course of that, I spent a lot of time with the Chinese government, different parts of the Chinese government, different levels, all the way from Beijing and Shanghai, which are the centers of power, to, so I would say, mid-sized cities, to smaller cities and villages in rural China. And across the board, the impression that one gets of the state in China is that it runs like a giant corporation, with all the pros and cons associated with that. In other words, there are very, very strong incentives for people up and down the party hierarchy it's relatively clear what one needs to do to progress up the hierarchy.
So you
it's
mentioned-
generally merit-based and so on. So as you can see, I mean, these are terms that we would use for a normal corporation in the United States, and I think it's fair to say that it's quite distinct from the average situation in the Indian government.
I think something struck me in there, like, you know, that you have the best talent in China going into the government apparatus because of the incentives that you were talking about.
Yes, it's a good thing to highlight. A lot of people that I've come to know in the last 15 years or so in China, mainland Chinese, are members of the party, the Communist Party, and many of them hold day jobs that are not that different from the average professionals that we see in wandering around Delhi or Bombay or any of our metropolitan cities. I think if you did the thought experiment and asked which senior engineer or senior marketing professional in one of the big 10 Indian companies would also be a member of a political party, the answer would be zero.
Very little. Yeah.
And I think the answer in China would be a very high percentage.
Okay.
And that's not for ideological reasons. It's not that people aspire to communism, qua-communism, the way the theory of communism was expounded by Marx and Engels and others.
Yeah.
It's a very practical reason that the power structure is set up so that affiliating with the party, which by the way is in many cases itself a meritocratic act, is seen as a way that you can get ahead. And in and of itself, I don't see very much wrong with that. There are, of course, pluses and minuses to every system, but the net result, as you rightly pointed out, is that good talent and government service are not antithetical to each other. Whereas I think, unfortunately, except in the past 5 years, and this is something that does give me hope to see younger, talented people going into politics and public service in India, and I hope that's something we can come back to. But by and large, as I was growing up or watching my cohorts, our cohorts coming through the professional ranks, I think good talent tended not to go into the public sector, and that's too bad.
So we'll actually come back to this in a little bit, but going back to the question of talent,
Yes.
and in the private sector and entrepreneurship, which is on the rise in India. So what is your view on this? How are Indian companies doing, and how can they do better globally?
So I'm a unabashed bull on this, that I'm extremely heartened by the enormous strides that Indian companies and entrepreneurs, and I don't mean just the flashier ones that we hear about, but across the board, the so-called SME, small and medium enterprise segment, and the larger corporations that are now traded on multiple exchanges around the world, I think there have been enormous strides in the past 15 years. And the good news is that whereas it used to be, I think it's fair to say, dismissed as a one-sector story, perhaps it was offshoring or BPOs or call centers or software services. I think there's a sense in which there is a very positive catalytic effect that these sectors have exerted on other sectors in the economy, so that it's no longer sufficient for other sectors to say that this is how it's always done in India, because you can point to an exemplar of world-class products and services being offered from India, despite the infrastructure compromises that have to be made. And the good news is that this is really I think of it as concentric circles radiating out from the call centers and software services, so that other people are now doing this also. So I'm really bullish, and I think the best of India can compete with the best of the world quite easily and win. So I'm very, very pleased by that.
So in that context, tell me, like, in the US, for example, in the market, you would see, if you have the SME sector, the percentage of companies in the SME sector compared to other developed countries is fairly low. So the companies that really make it big are the ones which, build on scale and build on size and do really well. And in India, in comparison, you've got like another billion entrepreneurs out there, many of them in the SME sector. So what is the prospect for the SME sector in India? You think, like, the way forward would